and welcome to another expert sales interview. My name is John Golden from SalesPOP Online Sales Magazine and Pipeliner CRM. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Jason Jordan from Vantage Point. Welcome, Jason.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Yeah. And Jason is the author of, Cracking the Sales Management Code, a great book, one I highly recommend to anybody if you want to really understand sales management. It's a great read and a very practical one too. So today I thought we'd talk about pipeline management, and I just thought we'd baseline it a little bit, Jason, and maybe you could just explain what is pipeline management from your point of view, because I think people sometimes look at it different ways or interpret it differently.
Well, it is. I think it's one of the biggest problems. I mean, if you ask people what's really important in their sales force, particularly senior leadership, they'll say the pipeline. But when you start picking at what that actually means to them, it can mean a lot of different things. And the biggest misconception we see is that the sales pipeline is the same as forecasting.
Right.
So literally, this is a true story. I'm talking to the head of sales for a $30 billion client of ours, and asked him what was the most important thing we could help with. And he said, the pipeline. And I said, I thought that's kind of interesting because you have consumer businesses and government businesses, and the pipeline's kind of a business to business idea. And he said, well, no. He said, I'd feel better if I knew anytime someone put something that's committed in the pipeline that it was committed. And at that point, I knew he was really talking about forecasting.
Right.
So first talk about the distinction between those two, because I think it's kind of important. In our mind, forecasting is looking to the future, right? I mean, it's trying to predict where you'll be at a certain point in time. And pipeline management is about trying to get there, right? It's about managing the pipeline of deals that you have. And so in our minds, pipeline management, a pipeline is a collection of your active opportunities. And so, you have a lead and you qualify it and it becomes a real opportunity, and then you either win or lose it. And there's a sale with a discrete beginning and a discrete end. So that's an opportunity, and we call a pipeline a collection of those. Your active opportunities that you're pursuing. And it seems like a simple thing to say, but if you look at people and they're managing their pipeline, first of all, it might be forecasting, but even in the pipeline, they might have relationships. Right? So they're managing strategic accounts, and they call that a pipeline. And it gets very difficult to talk about it. From our perspective, it gets very difficult to manage and coach it, and it surely is difficult to measure it if you don't have it defined in a way that everyone understands.
So, it's one of the first things you do when you work with organizations is to get those definitions tight, because I think having a common language or a common understanding of what different things mean is obviously critical to, as you say, being able to manage and measure.
Oh, it's so critical. And I think that this is one of the biggest barriers we have in sales forces generally, is lack of a common language. You could point to a lot of things. There's not an education in sales as there is in finance, right? There's no generally accounted principles, generally accepted accounting principles. There's no statistical process control like there is in manufacturing. I mean, we come to this novices. We come to sales and we start learning. And so there's a problem, which is the common language. And I mean, even what someone calls a call plan. What's a call plan? Right? It can mean 5 different things to 5 different people. And I think it does matter, particularly when you start talking about coaching. I mean, in itself, what's coaching? We could argue what the definition of coaching is, but one of the first things we do when we start engaging with people around pipeline management issues is we point out that you have to have a well-defined sales pipeline, or a well-defined sales process is probably a better way to say it. Because if you don't have a well-defined sales process, then what are you managing?
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
Just one more thing, we did some research with the Sales Management Association into sales pipelines, and the number one thing we found that made a productive sales pipeline was having a well-defined sales process. Without it, you can't manage your pipeline. You just have stuff in there, and you don't know where it is. You don't know why it's where it is. It's really difficult to have a conversation around it. And if you can't have a conversation around it, you can't measure it, report it, or coach it.
So on that point of sales process, so why is that something that is still even talked about? I mean, you would think at this stage that it'd be a given for most organizations who are involved in sales, which is most organizations, that they would have a defined sales process. And there's enough research out there that says, the best performing sales organizations have a defined sales process, and also like even granularly defined within each stage. But yet there still seems to be either a resistance or lip service paid to sales process in a lot of organizations.
It's true. We tend to work with larger organizations, and we don't see it as much as I did earlier in my career when I was working with smaller and mid-sized organizations. I think that sales operations and CRM have really pushed the issue that we need a sales process, and it has to be defined, or else you can't put it in the CRM tool, and you can't do anything with it. Honestly, I'm not being even cynical. If we didn't have CRM, I don't think we'd have any sales processes.
Right.
It's literally to that level of importance that CRM put on, the light that CRM shed on the sales process or lack of it. And so I think one thing is just culturally, salespeople don't like to be told what to do. I'm generalizing, but
Sure.
I think I can. And so it's a cultural thing. A lot of times you don't want to be too directive. Leadership doesn't want to feel like they're micromanaging their sales team. But I think as well, it's just a general misunderstanding of what the sales process is. You and I could talk for half an hour just over the distinction between sales activity, sales process, and sales methodology. And then you layer in all the metrics and other kind of management interactions that you have. And it's a complex thing, but the best advice is you just have to define your process and go with it. And you have to manage it, and you have to enforce it, and have to hold your salespeople accountable for using it. And CRM is a big part of that, obviously.
So let's get back. So sales process and pipeline management, obviously, intertwined. But what are some of the mistakes that managers make when it comes to managing a pipeline?
Oh my gosh, there's so many. This is again another day-long conversation. But some of the biggest ones is I think, and this is from our pipeline coaching training program. So I'm kind of pulling from what I know, but the research we have shows this. And one of the biggest issues is determining the proper size of the sales pipeline. Sales leadership, sales managers, and even salespeople to some degree think that a bigger sales pipeline is better.
Sure.
Our research shows that you can have a much smaller sales pipeline and actually have a more productive sales pipeline, because what happens is all the junk gets in there and just starts bouncing around, and that's how your sales cycle drags out, and your close rates get so low, is because there's just junk in there that's never going to close. But the sales team's terrified to pull it out because it's just pipeline. So first is the size of the sales pipeline, and it doesn't take a scientist to figure that out. You just have to sit down and be deliberate about it. Another thing we see, and this is particularly dangerous with frontline sales managers, which is where we live our lives largely, is the proclivity to engage late in the sales cycle.
Right.
So sales managers, and for the purposes of forecasting, largely they're obsessed over deals that are about to close in the next week, 2 weeks, 30 days, 90 days, whatever the end of the sales cycle is, depending on how long the sales cycle is. And it makes sense, right? These are deals are going to be won or lost, and you don't want to lose them. And so the sales manager thinks that's where the best effort is put. But our research and our observations, and I'm sure you would agree, would say that engaging earlier in the sales process can be as impactful for sales productivity, because that's when you do start to pull out the bad deals early. And if you're coaching salespeople early in the sales process, early in the sales pipeline, then you can help the salesperson shape the deal in the customer's mind, right? When they're trying to decide what are the set of products I'm going to evaluate and what is the decision criteria I'm going to use. And so I think just those two, we've seen move the needle substantially, just really focusing on what's a healthy sales pipeline. And then secondly, engaging earlier in the process so that you can set the stage for success rather than just pounding at the end of the process.
No, I totally agree with both of those. Back when I was at Hathaway, we coined a phrase, the feel good funnel. It's one where you stuff the early stages, and you go, well, things are rough right now, but in 6 months we're going to have it's going to be fantastic. And of course, in 6 months' time, you're in the same space because you just stuffed the funnel with junk.
Well, it's funny, John, because we can sit down with sales managers and they'll agree to this. Mm-hmm. And then you see what they actually do. They can't take stuff out of the sales pipeline as much as they'll agree. Oh yeah. Healthy sales pipeline is better than a big sales pipeline. Like actually pressing delete, or pressing closed lost or close no decision on it's literally fighting everything.
So how do you help them overcome that reticence to do that?
Well, nothing gets overcome in an organization without senior sales leadership's buy-in and support. And so I think that's it's one of the reasons that the pipeline remains bloated, is because people don't want levels above them to see a small sales pipeline. a salesperson can look, and you've done this, I've done when I'm in sales, right? You look at a pipeline, you know there's junk in there,
Yeah.
but you don't want it to be 2 million, you want it to be 4 million because you're afraid someone above you is going to see it suddenly go 4 to 2. So there's surely senior leadership has to buy into this idea that we're going to have smaller sales pipelines, at least for the next 3, 6, 9 months until we start refilling it with good opportunities. So that's important. And then also just setting of expectations. I think that helping people understand what the proper size for a sales pipeline is a step in that step along the way. If someone has a $3 million sales pipeline, and you can say, look, if this could be $2 million if you pull the stuff out, and if you close, and if you kind of set the expectations, then it's also easier to abide. But the biggest problem is that there's just an expectation that a bigger pipeline is a better pipeline, and people at the lower end of the side of lower ranks of the organization are afraid someone above them is going to think that they're going the wrong direction. So it's just a cultural thing and a leadership thing.
And I've great sympathy for that. I mean, I went through it myself with an organization where we did exactly this, where we decided we'd go for quality and be much more rigorous about what came into our pipeline. And we went through this exact scenario you're talking about, parent company was saying, wow, your pipelines have gone down dramatically. And we're saying, yeah, but look, our revenues are actually going up a little bit.
Win rates just doubled.
Yeah, wow. Exactly. But you do have to have the courage to go through a period that maybe it'll go backwards a little bit before it goes forward. On the other point,
it's a leap of faith.
Absolutely. On the other point that you raised, how do you help sales managers again kind of get out of that natural pull towards being super closers and being at the end of the pipeline and going early in the pipeline? Because as you say, the pressure is on them. They've got to deliver their numbers. They feel more comfortable probably in a closer role than they do in the coaching role or the earlier kind of analytic role. So how do you help them get to that point where they're comfortable doing that?
Well, again, it's a hard thing to do. There are a number of reasons sales managers gravitate toward the end of the sales pipeline. It's those deals have been forecasted. They're visible to senior leadership. It's fun to sell, right? Most sales managers, if you were inside their head, they wouldn't mind being a salesperson again. I shouldn't say most, but many, for a number of reasons. So there are a number of reasons. But it comes down to a couple of things. First of all, you can't dispute fact, right? So we've had success in clients who have chosen to make that change, and you can prove it with data and say this is how it goes. But the more important thing we've done with clients, which is a very practical reality, is if they have a pipeline review meeting, they're going to go over the late stage deals, right? Or if they're smart, they're going to take 1 or 2 deals and they're going to really drill down into those and try to coach. What we've said is just have a separate meeting.
Right.
Just have a completely separate meeting where you go over nothing but new opportunities. And whether you do it in a group, maybe it's more efficient, there's more joint learning, or whether you do it individually, just have your pipeline review meeting that you're having, scrub the data, do the forecast, but maybe once a week or once every 2 weeks, just sit down and talk about new opportunities. And then, when it's that discreetly stated that this is a conversation about new opportunities, then people tend to do it. But if you let them continue to commingle forecasting and late stage intervention and early stage intervention, it always gravitates toward the forecast.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great suggestion, and a great practical takeaway is to do separate meetings, because I agree with you. Because if you, as you know yourself, if you get into a meeting and you start discussing late stage deals or the pipeline, you're never going to get to anything else, because that's just going to suck up all the time and all the energy and all the focus. So what are some examples of where you've worked with organizations where you've really helped them with pipeline management, and what are some of the things that you've done? Obviously these are some of them, but what are some of the other things, and how have you seen the results, and what has their reaction been to it? Because I think sometimes people are skeptical about these things.
So we, I'd love to share some actual client names with you, but probably not appropriate.
Yeah, it's okay. No, we don't need to.
Yeah. So we actually have a program which we developed working with GE many years ago at GE Capital. Actually, I just shared a name. So that's been many years ago, and they've sold a lot of that business, but we worked with them, and actually it was kind of the basis of what we call now our pipeline coaching program. And so what we really try to emphasize in this program is that the pipeline is not a forecasting tool, it's a coaching tool. And the greatest thing you can do with a sales pipeline is coach. And sales managers buy that. I mean, sales managers want to coach. They understand it's important. The other thing we emphasize, just as I said earlier, is you have to really get to the front end of the sales pipeline. And there's a lot of good to be done there. We help people understand the proper size of the sales pipeline, and the results that we have from these types of interactions. And we also, if they don't have a good coaching methodology or they don't have good coaching hygiene, we work on their coaching as well, because obviously all of this comes down to a conversation between a salesperson, sales manager, and so the predictable things happen. Maybe the sales pipeline gets smaller, maybe not. We kind of have mixed reviews there, but what we do see is the volume of coaching increases dramatically because we're calling it coaching. Right? We're saying here's a separate meeting where you're going to be coaching, and everyone knows they're coaching. Another thing that predictably happens is the win rates will increase. And initially, it's just because all the bad stuff is coming out. But over time, they continue to increase because, again, there's been a lens on early stage coaching, and the stage is set to win. And the salespeople are more confident in what they're doing. And it puts and something that typically happens, which is not completely intuitive, is that the volume of prospecting will actually increase because they're not spending time chasing all these bad deals, and there's a focus on new opportunities going into the sales pipeline. And so in addition to the pipeline maybe getting smaller, close rates definitely getting bigger, we see an increase in activity at the front end of the pipeline because suddenly it's in focus where it's never been before. And so I could pull forward percentages and dollar. Most important thing is to understand what would actually happen if someone actually did this, right?
Yeah, and I think that's as you said, I think that's the most important thing about the fact that done properly, it actually creates more time to do more high value activities than, as we say, flogging dead horses.
Yeah.
Just another thing to touch on before we finish. So part of what you were talking about there is obviously the sales manager having conversations and coaching the salesperson. Now, this is a skill that needs to be taught as well because, right, a lot of sales managers are promoted from salespeople or whatever. But, coaching somebody is very different than telling them what to do or showing them and saying, this is how I would do it. This is how, just watch and learn. So how critical a part is that, and how much time and emphasis do you put on teaching sales managers how to speak to salespeople?
Well, it's critical. I mean, as I said, all the analytics, all the reporting, all the strategy comes down to weekly conversations between a sales manager and salesperson. That's what we're talking about with coaching largely is, taking the analytics, identifying areas of opportunity, and having conversations. And if the conversations don't go well, then all the strategy, all the analytics doesn't help. And so it's a huge thing getting coaching right. But something interesting about coaching. If we take a bunch of sales managers and we put them in a room and we say, okay, we're going to role play coaching. Mm-hmm. They actually do an okay job of coaching. It's kind of funny, people, especially in larger companies we work with. Most sales managers at a point in their career have been taught to coach. They've read books because they're personally motivated to get better. They've been through courses after courses after course, and they generally know how to coach, or at least they do a competent job, much more competent than you see them when you observe them in the field. My take on this is that a lot of the reason coaching doesn't take place is there's no logical place for it on the calendar.
Right.
And if we just said, and we've had luck with clients in this regard, if we just said, look, have your forecasting meeting, have your whatever you got to do. Let's just put a meeting on the calendar let's just call it the coaching meeting. Like literally, let's call it a coaching meeting, whether it's pipeline coaching or performance coaching, whatever, process coaching, whatever you want to call it. And when a salesperson comes to an interaction and a sales manager comes to an interaction, knowing coaching is going to take place, almost like creating that venue, like a hotel room, lunch managers.
Right.
When people come prepared to be coached and to coach, coaching actually takes place. I mean, without even a lot more training and enablement, it's just setting the expectation that this is what coaching looks like. Here's where it's going to take place, and people are pretty good at it. And so it's critically important. And I think most companies and most sales managers could be better at it. They can develop their skills. There is a deficit there. There's surely inconsistency across the skill set. But the first thing you can do that doesn't take any investment in training is just make sure people know what it is and make sure there's a place for it to happen.
Yeah, no, I love that idea, and I like that idea of just calling it coaching and putting something on the calendar. And I guess the other part of that is to if you put it on the calendar, make sure you actually do it rather than it always become the one that gets moved or cancelled,
Yeah.
because then you
Yeah.
tend to put a value on it, right?
Well,
Okay.
I had an interesting. We had a client one time. Sorry to interrupt,
No, go.
but this is kind of a quick story. We had a client one time, and he was committed to this, and he was a kind of a regional sales leader, right? So, as I said, it's got to come from the top. And what he told his team was, we're going to have these meetings every other week. And so, with every salesperson, you're going to meet twice a month, every other week, and you're going to have these conversations for a half an hour. And he said, you can move it. If something's going to come up,
Sure.
a customer meeting is going to come up, something's going to happen, someone's going to be sick, but you will never cancel one.
Right.
Says, I invite you to move it. If you have it Thursday afternoon and you want to have it Friday afternoon instead, out of convenience, fine. But you can move them, but you will not cancel them. And that's an interesting distinction that I hadn't thought about until he shared that. He said, I don't. Things are going to come up. You just can't use it as an excuse. This is going to happen.
Yeah, I think that's another great takeaway for everyone. All right, well, listen, Jason, we're bumping up against the 20 minutes here. This has been a great conversation. I wanted to give you a few moments to tell the viewers a little bit more about you, about your organization, what you do, and how they can contact you.
Sure. Thank you for that opportunity. So I'm Jason Jordan, as you mentioned. I'm with a company called Vantage Point, as you also mentioned. And our company trains and develops sales managers. That's our distinction. So if you imagine a sales training company, and then you imagine the best sales training experience you ever had, and then you imagine that was pointed towards your sales managers. That's the company we aspire to be. So we do a lot of research on management issues, right? Coaching, obviously, CRM, how to use data to manage and coach, pipeline management, forecasting, a lot of the issues that people deal with every day. And so we really are committed to making sales managers, and particularly frontline sales managers, better at their jobs, because we think, as you pointed out, people get promoted and they become sales managers, and then what? And
Exactly.
we want to be the what, right? We want to intervene there and hopefully make that team better, because we know if sales managers are better, salespeople are better. Yeah. And so that's our focus.
Yeah, no, and I'm a firm believer that the sales manager is your greatest revenue multiplier in any organization, because if they're operating at an optimal level, then you're going to be getting the best out of your salespeople. So I think it's a critical piece. All right, well, listen, thanks, Jason. Again, Jason Jordan from Vantage Point. My name is John Golden from SalesPOP Online Sales Magazine and Pipeliner CRM. This is another expert interview. We'll see you for another one really soon. Thank you.
Thanks, John.